I always enjoy this final panel because it's sort of a reflection time and a time to hit on anything that we haven't covered already.
Yeah.
Like so many speakers have hit so many topics, but of course there are always things that we didn't talk about. There are too many topics in this. So yeah, I would like to welcome to the virtual stage folks from our advisory board, previous speakers. So they're all going to come on and unface mute. And basically, this is just time if you have questions for us. And Sans folks, maybe you can point me. Is there a hallway channel?
We have, is it the summit discussion
Summit
or do
discussion? You want to
Yeah.
make it summit discussion?
Let's just make it one summit discussion. So if you have things that you want the panel to talk about, if you have questions, just go to one summit discussion. We'll make it nice and simple there. So the first topic to kick off, and with my apologies, I cannot remember the person who brought this up yesterday, but someone said yesterday, like there's a lot of content at this summit, awesome content geared to beginners, which we want to focus on. We have the new to cyber threat intelligence channel. That's awesome. But they said, hey, there are also folks here who are maybe mid or, longer on in their careers. And so I'd love to get everyone's take on what advice do we have for those who are maybe mid or senior career? How can they grow? What are your thoughts on what they should be doing to advance their careers? Who wants to start? Lillian raised her hand. Oh my gosh. Moderator's dream.
Oh,
Lillian,
I'm
go for
impressed.
it. All
Using the
you.
actual function. Nice.
This is actually a habit that we picked up, at least in our company, just to be very intentional, making sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak. So you raise your hand and you queue and you stack. One of the things that I'm always going to encourage people is advocate for yourself. Again, in my talk and in some of the other talks, we talk about this imposter syndrome. And to some degree, absolutely, there are certain identities and certain people who have imposter syndrome. But imposter syndrome, to a certain degree, is also BS. It's just an expectation that is placed on certain people to speak and not speak. Get rid of it. Just speak, use your voice, talk when you want to talk. One of the things, and this is very challenging for me, I talked about this in my keynote, is like speaking up for myself and advocating for myself. It's really uncomfortable, but I can say that it's been pretty successful. When I left Booz Allen, I was a people manager with Booz Allen, and I left and I joined Yahoo as an individual contributor. I decided that there were just some aspects of Booz Allen's method of people management that I was just not a huge fan of. But when I got to Yahoo, I had really intentional conversations with my manager and my skip level manager, and talked about how, hey, if there's an opportunity, I'd like to give this a shot. And when I left to go out on maternity leave, a job to lead my team actually opened up, and my manager called me on maternity leave and said, do you want this? And I said, well, we can either hire an idiot or I can be that idiot. And so I put my hand up and I got hired as that manager coming out of maternity leave. And so if you don't voice it or express it or advocate for yourself and say, this is where I want to go in my career, oftentimes people won't know to help you. They can guess, but it also goes towards that platinum rule, which is treat people how they want to be treated. And for me to know how you want to be treated, you need to tell me. So that's kind of my piece of advice.
I've got one that can build on Becca yesterday in systems for what I do with the team at Digital Shadows. I kind of bucket training and development into 3 different areas. One is there's just internal training that we can do. So we do lunch and learns, we do brown bags. We might have someone that's an expert on Russian cyber criminal tradecraft that's leveling up the teams that aren't the Russian linguists and things like that. So it doesn't cost me any money from my budget to do that. Then I worked with the CFO this year, and we got a dollar amount per employee for training at their own discretion. And I like to talk about it like a Venn diagram. There's like the needs of my company, there's the desire of the employee. They're never going to be 100% overlap, but let's get as much as we can, but give someone, they want to go to a Bellingcat course or something like that. Okay, cool. OSINT ties into what we do is there. And then the third one, which I try to keep separate, and I've done it this year in the budget, I keep it separate from the individual training budget, is tooling. So let's say it's on the security team, I'll give an example. It's Zscaler, or maybe it's passive total or whatever it is. I have product specific training for the people that own those. So I try to do internal training that we just do to lunch and learns. Also rotations. We've done rotations on teams to different functional areas within the groups. Then individual headcount budget. It's not huge money, but at least people have a little discretion. And then I have the actual tooling specific. And then we have development plans there. You know, it's a work in progress. We're always working towards it and things like that. But that's one thing that I've done and worked with the CFO on specifically.
So I think for mid and more senior level CTI, one of the biggest things that I've discovered is I have a lot more face time with a lot more of my customers. And, you know, from a personal development sort of angle, you know, I really start doing more presentations, you know, and really training my sort of verbal sort of presentation skills, right? And that's watching videos, you know, some TED Talks about how you can be a better TED Talker, right? Stuff like that. And it's very critical because, you know, I think one, you have this direct face time with your customer and you want to relay critical information as clean and concise as possible, but also being able to receive what they're, you know, what they're talking, what they're relaying, right? So that is on the more personal growth path that I'm currently still doing. And it's really hard to master talking in front of a lot of people.
I don't know that anyone masters it. It's just practice. And I think that's a great one. Tony, what do you think on this topic?
You know, one of the biggest things that I guess I would always advocate is never stop learning from your peers. CTI was not something that I got to do by default. In law enforcement, we had intel analysts that did intel analyst stuff. At private sector, we had other groups that did that. And from an investigation standpoint, we didn't talk to the intel folks when it came to anything. I had to learn this. And it's the same thing. If you're in intel, one of the best ways to really enhance your acumen is, you know, what are your IR people doing? What are your pen testers doing? What are your finance people doing? You know, you never know what that linchpin could be where you can pivot into something different or use your technical expertise to actually help another area out that may not know what that is. You know, case in point with a lot of that cryptocurrency stuff that we had in my presentation, that is something that I'm getting a lot of forensic accountants asking me about, just on the outside world and through the network, like, hey, Tony, what do I got to do with cryptocurrency? Because I'm starting to see that, you know, affecting us as a company. And if that's your niche, you've got a whole other industry that is chomping at the bit for you.
Tony, as you were talking, I just had a thought. One of the things I'm working on in my career development is better partnering with teams across the organization. I think this kind of is reminiscent of Samara's talk, right? Integrated intelligence. But what I'm learning is that, especially as I'm advancing as a leader, or trying to improve and make my impact and my team's impact more, partnering with those across the organization is key, right? I'm going out and meeting product folks, marketing folks. It might differ depending on your organization, but I think that's one thing I'd recommend, that especially if you're trying to get to a leadership level, first-time manager, et cetera, I think talking to different teams and leaders in your organization, making strategic partnerships is something I would really recommend. Brian, what are your thoughts on career development, mid-senior level? What do you got for us?
Well, I think that one thing you have to remember is it's your career, it's your responsibility, right? So you're waiting for somebody else to take a huge interest in your career development is not a good strategy. And just like, you know, Lillian said, you know, be mindful of what you actually want. And what Tony brought up is, you know, you ask questions, go out and meet people, and even you, like when you're reaching out to other teams, find out what's out there. If you're interested in this type of intel, go figure it out. When I was in the Marine Corps, cyber intelligence still hadn't, you know, intelligence was over here and the cyber stuff was over here, and they still hadn't bridged the gap yet. So I spent a lot of time on my own taking SANS classes and getting certifications, because that's where my interest was. And eventually that's where my career led me. So a big part of it is, if you're interested in advancing your career, you need to invest in it and take responsibility for it. It may not be in the organization you're in, and just be open to that. So.
JD, what do you got for us? You have a slightly different perspective, and I love that, right? From your academic perspective you bring. What are your thoughts on this?
Both from the practitioner and the academic side. The first line would be, the further forward you want to go, the deeper and further back you're going to have to reach. In order to solve challenges you haven't encountered or that your organization hasn't encountered before, you're going to have to find equivalent tradecraft from other disciplines. You're going to have to find other intelligence history and other dynamics that you can adapt into this environment. There's nothing new under the sun. We just need to understand the parallels where the theory works and where it falls down, and potentially to bridge into new theory. And the second piece I'll give you is, find the folks that are in equivalent positions or were in equivalent positions to you as your peers and as your support group, your fellowship groups. It's not merely a matter of finding folks that can mentor you and be this kind of senior rabbi to move you through your career. The most important folks you will find are the folks that had to make it up as they went along and did so in the way you're having to make it up as they went along. And I can call out the folks that have been important to me over the years, and not all of them were core cyber folks. I mean, Jan Herring, he was National Intelligence Officer for Science and Technology at one point in time, taught me a tremendous amount, even though he sits in the competitive intelligence field. John McCreary sits in the warning field, and did a lot with J2, unfortunately he's passed on now. I can talk about Jan Herring, who bluntly, without him, we wouldn't have Cynthia Grabo's work. I can talk about folks like Dave Eitel. Even though he worked in the pure offensive side, he's taught me a tremendous amount over the years. I won't name some others because I know I would probably embarrass them. Not the folks I usually throw out there, but there are very few folks that walk the same roads that you will have. Find them and spend the time to get to know them.
Love it. Becca, what do you think?
I was just going to throw out that some point in your career, many of you, I know I am in a little bit in the middle of this, will realize that you have a choice and you have a say in what you want to do. And before you can get to that point where you advocate for promotions or anything like that, you should make sure you're actually doing what you want. And so I was just going to recommend a book. There's two books actually. One's called Designing Your Life, and the other is called Designing Your Work Life. I may or may not be reading that right now. That really helps you zero in on your passions and your inspiration and what's important to you. So you can kind of refine what you want the next stage in your life to be. They talk about you don't just have one career and that's it. You can actually choose. And especially once you get towards mid and senior level in your career, I think you have a lot more choice and a lot more flexibility to shift or to pull in things that are important or to move into some of those theoretical areas that JD mentioned. Even if it's not a real job that exists now, you have some power to advocate for yourself. So take the time to figure out what you want to do as well.
That advice. And Becca, I think I dropped the right book links into the Summit discussion channel, but you can double check. Bethany, we're so glad you could join us. What are your thoughts on this? I'd love to get your perspective.
So I think similar to what you said, going out and learning about different parts of your business, that's identity access management, IT strategy, marketing, well into the business, like business strategy, finance. And so, if you take that a step further, I think there's some good initial conversation in the community about should people get MBAs? Should people start taking short business classes online? There's a ton of free or low cost resources out there, just learning the language of the business, to make us more relevant to our stakeholders and our customers. Being able to grow, what we do from security, outward across the rest of the business. And then two, person that gives you some pivot. Like Rebecca just said, are you doing what you want? Maybe you want a career change and you take what you've learned from here and you decide, well, now I have more job or career freedom because I have an MBA or I took a class in automation strategy, or, you've networked into your organization's IT strategy, stakeholders. So, the sky is kind of the limit. And honestly, everything you learn, you still bring back here and it just makes you a better cyber intel practitioner.
Lillian, what do you have to add to this? Unmuting is hard sometimes.
I feel ya. So a couple of points. I wanted to chime in something you mentioned, Katie, about leadership and things to do. Like once you get higher in levels of leadership, it's actually more about influence and talking to people and less about maybe some of those tangible like tactical skills. And then also to piggyback off something Rebecca just said, one thing that at least has helped me is to think of your career. It's not a career ladder, it's a career jungle gym. You're allowed to go sideways, you're allowed to go down, you're allowed to go up, you're allowed to go crooked. It's not a straight path. You get to pick your path and decide how you want to go. There's no prescribed way. You have to really kind of know what you want and know what you want to do and know where you kind of want to be. And sometimes, 21-year-old Lillian did not think she was going to be here. 21-year-old Lillian refused to get married or have kids, and I've done both of those things. So like your goals can change, things can happen in life, and that's just it's about reassessing, taking a look at yourself and deciding what you really want to do and not what other people have expectations for you.
I love that. Decide what you want for yourself. You set your own expectations. Megan, you gave an amazing workshop on kind of getting into CTI, but I'm sure you have thoughts on advancing as well. Megan, what are your thoughts on this? I'd love to hear from you.
Sure, thank you. So I would say the first thing, and I think this actually applies to anyone, is any sort of goal that you want to accomplish, you need to map it out. So if you're thinking about things quarterly, thinking about what do I want to get done in quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. So be really strategic and map those out incrementally. There's a book that both has a book and a workbook to it. And Beck actually mentioned it in her keynote, Atomic Habits. So I do actually really recommend that book if you're trying to think about what goals you're setting and working through those. The paired workbook I think is actually quite helpful if you haven't looked at that before as well. And then that is applicable to anyone, right? Then once you're more advanced in your career, as we know, cybersecurity is so vast, threat intelligence even, right? Like you can start as a generalist, then you need to decide where you want to go for diving deeper. So JD was kind of talking about, who in your life has walked different walks and done different things. So thinking about what really strikes your interest and maybe what people from different fields have you worked with and where are you really fascinated with or what are you really fascinated in and where do you want to go with your career and dive deeper. And maybe it's a sub-discipline or field that doesn't even exist yet and you're actually pairing a couple things together. I love intersectionality and kind of picking at things that are really fascinating just to me. And so figure out what is fascinating to you and where you want to dive deep into. And I think that's where you're going to find your passion, and then surround yourself with those people who also are like, yeah, that's my passion too. So if you're in that mid or advanced level, it's figuring out where you want to go deep.
I love that, Megan. Create some subfield that no one's thought of. Like that's pretty inspiring. Go do it. Grace, hopefully you've recovered from your amazing talk and had a moment to breathe. What are your thoughts on this? I'd love to hear from you.
I was manically reading through the channels. I was like, oh wait, I'm supposed to be on now. Okay, I'll look later. So I think here, especially because I come from a very different background and I still do that weird sub niche that doesn't quite exist in any job description out in the threat intel market and landscape. It's when you're entry level, when you're trying to get there, they don't really reward being really cross boundary and doing a lot of different things. You kind of pick and you start and you build your foundations with a more simple role that's out there, like analyst, whatever. But that's when you also can do volunteering, do efforts, have other side hustles, or start doing things within your organization that move towards what you want. And that's the thing that you will be rewarded for over and over versus being seen as a commodity, right? Doing the thing that was expected of you only. In addition to that, once you move into the more mid-level, what I see with the teams that we work with is that when you want to pivot, so many people think about that end goal and it seems too far, but you're building it into small intermediate steps. And you kind of look at those lateral steps too, versus just trying to throw yourself into that ultimate goal. And that gives you a lot of room to play and build off of things that you might not have already seen.
Thank you so much, Grace. I think we've had a lot of great recommendations on this topic, so I'd love to move on. If you have other topics you'd like us to hit, our time is quickly passing for the panel. But this is one that came in that I think is a good pivot from Grace's talk on information sharing, right? Someone asked, okay, what are our thoughts on getting legal counsels to get CTI to allow that sharing, right? What we've said in the last 2 days, good to do information sharing, but sometimes we might make mistakes, tell people things that aren't true or are wrong. There could be real repercussions of this. So I'm curious, right? Legal implications of information sharing. And we had a talk on this a few years ago. I'll see if I can dig up the link, but Rick, you want to kick us off on this one?
I can. I'll play the CISO role. Like, I think the CISO is a critical partner here, especially if most companies or many companies have e-commerce and things like that. So for me in my role, I do contract review. I do security addendums reviews. I work very closely. So I already have a relationship with my legal department. So I think the first thing I would say is, and it may be different in your organization, but look for allies within your business that already have a relationship with legal. So, you're not a random coming in saying, hey, we want to share, imagine legal, like, oh my God, you want to share the results of an investigation. There's all these sorts of things. Find out who has that relationship in the organization. For us, it would be me and it'd be the CISO. And I talk to legal. I talk to legal on a weekly basis. So I think that's first, like everything we've talked about it so much today, Grace's talk with networking, stuff like that, is get that foundation to have difficult conversations, not because it's an unprofessional conversation, right? But it could be a difficult conversation for the legal team to have to hear. So I think, I'll let someone else continue on there, but that's my first one, is leverage. Again, I'm looking at my notes, unknown, known, right? Is there somebody in your organization that already has that relationship that you can leverage to be your beachhead?
I think that ties into our previous discussion about the importance of having those relationships, right? As a leader, building those for your team. Lillian, do you have thoughts on this?
I have many thoughts, but I'll keep it brief. I responded a little bit in the chat. And one of the things that I will say is the team at Yahoo has really interesting position because we are a service provider, but yet we're a corporation. So we actually operate under different legal regimes. We have a legal regime where we operate with regards to user content. We control people's content, but we don't own it. So the ability to share that information is governed by the Stored Communications Act. Conversely, on our side, on the corporate side, our information is governed by CISA, which I think most organizations are, which, you have some latitude under, it's the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, not the government organization. It's confusing that they're named the same. But you do actually have a lot of latitude to share information. And again, I think we've been hammering this point. It goes towards influence and explaining to your legal counsel, hey, it's important for me to share this information because it's defensive. It's defensive for us. It'll protect us from litigation because it shows that we're partnering with other organizations to protect people or to protect the industry. Things like that. It's just finding those persuasive points. And also, again, being friendly with your legal counsel and other parts of the legal organization, because there's other aspects, unintended effects that could come into play here. So I'll stop there in case anyone else wants to chime in.
Grace, you just posted an awesome takeaway from your survey. Do you want to share that? I'm not going to read it for you because it's your baby.
Sure. Yeah, I have all of the raw notes and it's like 40 pages of open-ended responses. So thanks again to everyone. It's a quote from the open-ended on what would make most difference in sharing. It says, when I was working in the CTI space, having the support of leadership to reach out to other orgs or individuals in my network or another's network would have been the best thing possible. Similarly, there's a couple other ones. I just did a keyword search for CISO. It says, one of them said, what worked? Our CISO's amazing and a part of many groups. He comes back with intel to build detections off of recently. And another saying, share as much as humanly possible and make sure you have a good relationship with your CISO to get sign off.
Thank you. Other thoughts on this? This is always a tough one. And I did paste that presentation in from a previous summit. I think it's a tough one. Tony, yes, you all do a lot of incident response, and I'm sure you deal with insurance companies and lots of lawyers. I'd love your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so I've gotten to see this on both sides, private sector and then obviously consultancy. Private sector where it was literally standing up this module of a career. A lot of it's a lot of worry. Because to the point that Lillian was saying, they don't want to air dirty laundry and they don't want to make it known that something happened. What I have found across the board is you have to find what are tangible metrics for them. If that's money, if that's a specific type of threat, if it's ransomware, if it's phishing, and you've got to figure out how to tailor that and working with your teams. And don't, again, not to keep hitting on even our talk, but don't silo yourself to think that it's only you that has to make this. Get with other people like, hey, like I have to put something together for this based on phishing. Can you help me with that IR team? Can you help that, the SOC analyst, digital forensics people with investigations doing, e-discovery and litigation support? Can you help me with this? And trying to build that out. And I find that lawyers are a lot more receptive when you come with data.
Have data for any ask you are coming with. Grace, did you have something else to chime in with here before we go to Sherman?
Oh, no, go ahead, Sherman.
Cool. Sherman, go for it. Love your perspective on this too.
Thanks. Yeah, I straddle in a very weird spot since I'm operating under state and local government. So we're straddling a lot of different sort of entities, right? Both public, federal public, or private entity that actually helps New York City functions. And oftentimes, I think one of the hardest challenge is to sort of convey to our legal counsel or our CISO, what we are actually sharing, right? Like, because when we say, oh, we're information or intelligence sharing, they think we're sharing everything under the sun, every single bit of sensitive information about our own, internal network and so on and so forth. Of course, before sharing it to partners, most of it will be sanitized so that it will remain under a certain OPSEC threshold or operational security threshold. And that takes a lot of back and forth to sort of get with. And oftentimes, I think we also need to sort of first structure out like the format in which things are being shared, because that's the best way to at least start with some of the more external partnerships that we have.
Thank you, Sherman. I'd love to move on to this question that came in from, I think it was Alfredo earlier today, and I think it didn't get a lot of attention, but it's a really good one. He asked, are there any tips for small CTI teams that have just been created on what type of intelligence to focus on, right? For new teams just starting out. So I'd love to hear from various folks, right? What recommendations for teams for just starting out, especially what product, what can they do that's just like really high impact? Brian, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I love this topic because when we're working with teams, we often start out with this. And my first suggestion is to mine your email. Whoever your primary stakeholder is, your primary intelligence customer, usually it's the CISO. Just start with the last 3 months or maybe 6 months of what are all the things that they have asked you for in the last 6 months that you've actually received feedback, even if it was just a thumbs up or a thanks, got it, and start there. And then you can develop some generic requirements around that and share that with the CISO and say, hey, these are the things that we provide you. Here's what you've asked us for in the past. What do you think? It's always good to start with what you've already been asked for, because there's probably a perception of what the Intel team does that may or may not be correct, but it's still there. And so tapping into that, saying, hey, this is what we're doing so far. What do you think? What else would you want? So really just go back and mine that primary stakeholders request, because they're going to ask for something, you've done something in the past, make that your standard going forward. And remember, it's dynamic. What you're doing today may not be what you're doing in 3 months, 6 months, and that's okay. But you definitely want to develop whatever products you need to develop for whoever's asking for them.
It will change over time for sure. Aurelia, I'd love to hear from you. You had such an awesome presentation earlier, right? What thoughts do you have on recommendations for teams just starting out, products? What would you tell them?
There's so much information out there. It can get so overwhelming so quickly. Thankfully, I had Bethany and then Mike were also very gracious to help me out right before I onboarded with Cargill. But believe it or not, Katie, your Medium article where it's a self-paced CTI study, that thing, I reference that thing so often, and it's so well put together that I've used it several times for myself. And then for friends that are really curious about getting into the CTI field, that's the first thing I toss their way, because it's so helpful, and it has literally every resource you could possibly want to dive into, to just at least get yourself oriented mentally in that way, where you're gonna try to figure out exactly what you want to find, what you want to do. And then LinkedIn as well. Like LinkedIn, I know it had a rough start back in like the early 2010s. It was kind of starting to form into like a dating app for a little while. So I came off of that, but thankfully, they managed to figure it out. And LinkedIn has worked really well for me when I finished my degree. Went right back to LinkedIn and just started adding people that I thought might be either looking for CTI analysts, maybe looking for people that are willing to take a chance on somebody that's brand new into the field. And thankfully, that's precisely how Bethany and my leadership chain found me, was on LinkedIn. So don't be shy on LinkedIn. Definitely share your thoughts, share the articles and add some stuff to it.
I am terrible about LinkedIn. One of our SANS employees, Stephen Hart, calls me out and he's like, Kate, you need to work on your profile. So 2 people I trust saying that, I'll listen. Rick, what are your thoughts on this?
Start with your own data. I just dropped into the Slack channel a presentation from David from last year, using it actually ties back to what Brian said a little bit. It was like, look at what the CISO has been asking about for the past 3 months. Well, look at all the incidents that you've had, or the intrusions that you've had. You can use the format, Verus format, for those that know it, to categorize your own alerts going forward. And then you can start to see trends, and then you can do your own reporting on it. So before you go out and buy a commercial product from a vendor or anything like that, if you're not, mining your own stuff, you're going to waste your money. I would say you're not mature enough for an external party. You might actually try with your own stuff and then some open source stuff on top. Maybe use something like PulseDive, actually, that's going to help bring in a lot of different sources for you as well. You can talk to Grace about that particular one. But yeah, if you're not doing your own data, I would contend that you're going to be wasting your money.
Good advice. And that reminds me of a talk from, I think it was Ryan Kovar and Dave Harold, the Victory Garden a couple of years ago. I'll find that one, because grow your own intel. Megan, would love your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, very, very similar actually to what Rick was saying. I was going to say, know what you have. So thinking through setting up some scopes for what parameters you want to look at, and then setting up your own alerting around, what domains you have, what code repositories you have, making sure that you're doing alerting around different things that you have for looking for if there is any sort of like typo squatting going on with your own assets. I don't know what type of industry they're in. Are they in one industry? Are there other industry verticals that they need to be looking at? Is there geopol as a consideration that they might be needing to pay attention to? Is there misinformation, disinformation that they need to pay attention to? So there's a lot of unknowns with that question. So it might just be that they're in one industry. It could be that they're in other industries. So there's a lot of unknowns to that question. But depending on that, I really do think first starting though with what you have is going to be most paramount. And then you can do some comparative analysis with what you're doing within your industry and other industry alikes are doing. And I think that can be really helpful to ask around.
Another vote for internal analysis. I love it. JD, what are your thoughts?
So I take this in 2 directions. Most small shops face a challenge of both supporting the decision makers above and then some level of operational team that's doing something with that intel on the internal engagement side. From this, a senior Central Intelligence Agency official once said that the core product of the intelligence community is not actually an intelligence estimate or the president's daily brief. It's the national intelligence officers that deliver those. And it's focusing, particularly in those small teams, on being that intel officer that can, or intel analyst that can engage. So the elevator pitch product to the senior executives, talking about the things that are blowing up in the news that they might have heard about, enriched with the incidents that are happening in your organization that tie to whatever that wider threat perspective is going to be one of the most valuable things you can do day to day when you're very small. Conversely, the stand up with the operational teams, whether it's a shift change in a SOC, whether it's at some repetitive delivery cycle that fits your schedule for another organization, is going to be incredibly important, because they're going to know what they've been dealing with, what kind of incidents and tickets they've closed. They're going to know what kind of questions have come in from a fraud team. They're going to work those problems. The intel analyst or officer is going to be able to bring something to enrich that, and going to be able to give a perspective, perhaps the thing that isn't the alligator in front of the boat or the fire they're fighting at that moment, the thing that the other organizations that are like theirs might be getting hit with. And it's really honing in on that and allowing that to become this iterated cycle that then allows you to drive towards, okay, we have a type of current intelligence production, we have anticipatory intelligence production, we have more strategic focused work, and then we have the consumer outcomes meta products, which we don't talk a lot about. The idea that you will have a stoplight at the end of a month, a quarter product that says, okay, here are the questions that came in, here are the types of issues that we reacted to, here's where we had knowledge and intel advantage, here's where we didn't, and why. Was it a resource issue? Was it a collection issue? Was it another type of problem? That's how you go from being a small team to a team that's appropriately sized to the mission that you're trying to solve. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, JD. And Tony, we'll give you a final say on this topic before we move on.
Oh, joy. I would say make sure you don't bite off more than you can chew. I'm just as guilty as anybody. I remember when I first took 578 at SANS and was like, I'm going to take over the CTI world at my installation, and got there and tried setting everything up, and I just watched saturation kick in. And you feel defeated, you feel burnt out, and it's like a bottle rocket. You're going to shoot up in the air and you explode. And to everybody's point, it start off small, internal, and let it manifest and leverage your resources and your network and your leadership to help build out that team. And I think that that's the way to have successful, prolonged growth of the department and yourself.
Ending on a great note, Tony. No pressure at all. Ending right on a note of yourself and your team. For our final topic, before we start to wrap up, I wanted to shift to talking about the impact of the pandemic. We had a question come in, and this is one I've heard very commonly over the past 2+ years. Been a long 2 years, huh? How has the pandemic especially affected cyber threats? And maybe we can shift to also cyber threat intelligence in general. I first started looking at this shortly after the pandemic hit the United States. And what I found with this is that, right, adversaries were sort of using the pandemic as a topic for phishing, et cetera. And otherwise, though, a lot of like malware TTPs were the same. One thing I did find, though, and I think others have found this as well, so I'd love other perspectives on this, is that the shift to remote work actually influenced the attack surface a little bit. In that I think a lot of networks like VPNs, other security appliances were set up pretty quickly facing the internet without two-factor authentication, which, as we know, that's not a great security practice. And so I think it sort of created an opportunity for adversaries more than anything. So that's my thoughts, maybe just a slightly different attack surface. Sherman, what are your thoughts on this one, on the pandemic shifts?
I would say there's a major shift to at least how we operationalize CTI for organizations. Have you guys tried doing, any sort of roundtable analytical efforts on Zoom or it is a pain, especially because normally people are usually in a room together, either shouting at each other. There's a lot of talking. It is so much harder to sort of relay all these information within sort of a telecommunication framework. So that's a major shift. So that does cause some sort of slowdown in some of these analytical sort of products, if you will.
Other thoughts on this one? Yeah, Lillian, go for it.
So I'll comment a little bit on kind of like the threat actor side. It was kind of interesting, but because you could kind of tell where COVID was peaking and ebbing based on certain activity and certain targeting. You could tell that it would dovetail with, some of our adversarial countries. So that was really an interesting additional piece of attribution that you could use there. The other thing, to your point, is, we always want to think that everyone is going to be a good person and do the right thing. But those of us who have been here for a while and consider ourselves, I actually jokingly refer to myself as the internet janitor, know that there's going to be other people who are going to come and take advantage of this. And so there is certainly, like you alluded to, Katie, a rise in people taking advantage of things like, governments releasing pandemic money, selling, bunk COVID cures, the counterfeit masks and things like that. So, bad guys, I should say bad people, malicious actors are going to malicious. It's just a thing that's going to happen. And kind of it goes back to like the whole crux of CTI. You have to understand that there are humans behind this. Not all humans are great. And so you have to kind of think and figure out, how would I exploit this? And then, how do I counter that? I think that's kind of how that's changed. And one just kind of pot shot that I threw into Slack is working on Log4j, and Log4j was amazing remotely. I'm sure there are a lot of companies that kind of wish everyone were in a room, could order pizza and just get it done. And that just wasn't the case this time.
Let's go to Bethany and then Rebecca.
So Lena yesterday did a really good job of being able to take like large scale strategic geopolitical concepts and then tie them to really specific actors and events. I mean, fantastic. She did so in a way that I haven't ever really seen before. And I think when we also look at the pandemic, right, similar thing, whether they're non-state actors like criminal groups, you absolutely saw the effect of the COVID economy and pushing people into alternative areas of revenue. And, I think that's a larger scale picture of how to tie global economic issues, even like sanctions, to cyber actors. Then from the state-sponsored side, the pandemic just accelerated tectonic geopolitical shifts that have been in the works for a while, but it really just accelerated them. And then, when you look at nation states like China and Russia, you see some sort of divergent actions, specifically in, who's willing to take IP for their own pharmaceutical advantage during a pandemic, and then those who are willing to also target IP, but also sow disinformation. And I think too, as a community for cyber intel, we have to learn how to thread that needle of identifying disinformation and where that is or isn't like a corporate communications issue and how that relates to cyber intel. So you have all like this perfect storm of all these geopolitical events happening and they're playing out in cyber. So I think, the pandemic just accelerated things that were already happening. And it also revealed things that maybe were not getting priority attention previously. So yeah, that's about it. Also really need to plug Lena's talk again because it was fantastic.
It absolutely was. So many amazing talks. And Becca will probably give you final word here.
But luckily I have like a really good segue because I was going to.
Wonderful. You always do.
Really great data from the SANS CTI survey that Pascalia and I did. Both last year was the first year we asked about COVID impact. And then this year we're actually seeing the impacts of that on teams and their ability, how they're rating their efficiency, how much CTI is helping them. We have a webinar coming up February 23rd, so I will answer this question in much more depth there. But my spoiler alert is that we have a ton more new folks in CTI because with the expanded threat surface, the expanded threats and more people going to remote work, we saw a huge spike in not only brand new CTI teams, but brand new CTI teams where they are the only analysts. It is a team of one. And I've been there. And I know most of us have before. So if you have people from this summit or who you know reaching out to you on LinkedIn, which I hear is a wonderful place, Katie, you should spend more time there, or Twitter or Slack, please reach out, because we're growing as a community during a really difficult time for all of us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becca. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, panelists who joined us for this wrap-up panel.